From October 2010 to October 2019, Friendship is Magic graced our screens. 206 episodes were broadcast over 9 seasons, and while some were great, there were others that were absolutely atrocious. Despite outliers to the contrary, no show is perfect. I've said this many times on this channel, just so I can keep my hype levels on anything just low enough to where I won't be too disappointed if something doesn't meet any form of expectation I have. Others, however, may say otherwise. And while some shows have had complete seasons that are misfires, Friendship is Magic has avoided that mostly in totality, because seriously, when I critiqued all of them and averaged them accordingly, they kind of all just came out on the same wavelength anyway, so yeah, they may have more bad episodes in one compared to another, but overall, this show is pretty much the same, which is nice. However, on an episodic basis, there have been so many that have stained this show's record that just thinking about them makes my blood boil. That is abundantly clear thanks to just how inconsistent this show was from week to week when on air. Sure, this is a children's cartoon and you're bound to not hit home runs every single time, but seriously for a moment, out of the 206 episodes that were in the main series canon, 103 of them scored under an average C grade on my rating scale. That is nearly half of its entire selection, and I'm not including the Best Gift Ever, the Equestria Girls films or specials, or even the damn movie. So it makes me beg the question, how many negative episodes can a show put out? Well, many as the statistic stated, but some of them are the worst of the worst, and they will appear here, as these, in my opinion, are the 25 worst Friendship is Magic episodes, all being ranked in order of my disdain, which of course means this is a subjective matter as any, so please do not complain if something does or doesn't appear on here, because I want to keep the conversation in the comment section somewhat civilized. Thank you. So what graces their unwelcome presence on this, the most damaging of lists? Well, let's get started with part 1 and see just what will ruin our day. Friendship is Magic is regarded as fanciful, adventurous, and fun. Palatable at its least, but riveting at its highest, depending on your subjective opinion of those parameters. Sometimes, however, an episode can be none of those things, to where even a person in his 30s, like me, can roll their eyes with contempt. So answer me this. Who thought that an episode centered around Applejack doing someone's plumbing was a good idea? Yeah, I thought many of you wouldn't think so. Taking the most boring of the main 6 and putting her in a boring situation, all while leaving the more intriguing prospect of Twilight and Spike back at the farm out of view and out of mind, was only going to end with problems. And at the end of the day, this is the definition of stagnant slice of life that shows its weaknesses when the process of the job at hand holds no value to your eyes or ears. Yes, the utilitarian prospect of Applejack's skill set is shown well, but we've had other examples of that hapless, hard-working attitude before, with much firmer standard of consequence and impetus that actually mattered. Here, it just felt like a way of giving her something to do, all while what we don't see is left to fester and supply a moral that only comes to fruition right as it's appropriate to talk about it. How depressing is that? What purpose do we all get to see what we just saw? The structure was just so misguided, focusing on the wrong things, and was so redundant. It makes me wonder why they wasted an episode on something no one in their right mind would care about. I appreciate the changes in location and the subtle mocking of Rainbow Dash going against her tomboy image, but if that's all an episode has to fall back on, it screwed the pooch before it could get neutered. And all in all, this is a prime example of why Applejack's stock fell so quickly after the early seasons. Wasting her efforts on dilapidated things like this did not help. It's tragic and just makes me wish for something more whimsical, fun, and creative to be offered up instead of this tawdry slab of meat that we got here that's just stinking up the room the longer it festers. Starlight and Trixie, a duo who have many fans, including me, and they are a source of the wonderfully delightful Bob the Dalek's amazing fan art. Seriously, if there's one thing you learn from this video is this exists. so go check his stuff out if you haven't already. Anyway, their episodes are, so to speak, mixed in quality. Some are recommendable to all, whilst others make my personal stomach turn. However, there is one that signified that their usual formula for storytelling and character development had finally run out of gas and become incredibly stale. That was a Horseshoe-In. And if you don't believe me, look back at every single episode that featured these two since No Second Prances, and realise that up until this point they focused on a key part of Starlight's characterisation. She has a method to live her life and get things done that causes Trixie to get impatient and try to help, causing mayhem to ensue because Trixie's a hothead whose self-importance gets the better of her. And well, sure, On the Road to Friendship tackles the reverse of this, with Starlight being the irritant, but the majority of these occasions had Starlight being the one pushed to the edge. It took some time to realise this was such a recurring story aspect and conflict thread that proverbial did end up hitting the fan to highlight such. This was the one episode that just pushed it from sincere arguments between friends that felt natural into downright parody of itself. You know it can't fight back against those bruising punches. Starlight's constant reluctance to listen to her brain and drop Trixie from the Vice Headmare selection prolongs a predictable and frustrating trail that rarely raised the blood pressure, as the lack of viable candidates meant the outcome was kind of obvious, meaning that you had to retain as little patience as you could for anything interesting of note to occur, only to realise it never really did until they had to let the proverbial hit the goddamn fan in order to force their hand. A moral about putting all personal views aside and standing your ground, having someone find their position in the world, that does have some leverage given the story and feud at play, giving this episode some recourse to fall back on, but its tiresome antics that serve to benefit no one really do make it struggle to swim against the tide. And what hurts it more is that this was the last time either character was at the forefront of an episode before the series ended, and boy oh boy was this a disappointing flag to wave. I can grasp the importance in nailing these characters' futures down, but outside of that, this tale of tedium holds no other form of value, which is depressing when it contained characters noted for filling the show with fun over the years. At one point in time, this episode ranked in my bottom 5, and the fact it's only at number 23, frankly, disgusts me. I've waited 5 long years to finally go into this one in some form of detail, so strap yourselves in, everyone. It's time for me to rip the best night ever a new arsehole. This episode has always stuck in my craw, and, well, that's because there's a lot wrong with it. It starts out innocuously enough, setting itself up with the grand and romping at the gala, but once the song ends and the ponies go on their merry way, it starts to unravel. Literally. All our heroine's dreams, as established in the Ticketmaster, become walking nightmares for reasons that should have been obvious, and the moral at the end of the episode doesn't correlate at all with what we've seen for pretty much the entire duration beforehand. In the case of the latter, the fact that they were separated the entire night renders the spending time with my friends can make the worst night the best moral nonsensical, whilst their reactions to their situation is equally baffling when you apply context. Twilight surely wouldn't be so naive and stupid enough to not realise that Celestia would be busy at a royal function of all things. Applejack should have realised that Canterlot was snooty about their food way before the show cemented that into canon. Hell, I made note of it when analysing the Ticketmaster before I even got to this one, so if I'm able to notice it, why the blue hell did the writers not cock onto it? The fact Fluttershy is able to talk to animals without any issues in every moment following this, without consequence, implies that it was done conveniently for conflict's sake. At least we got a meme-worthy reaction out of her, so at least you can be happy with that. Rainbow Dash already spent a weekend training with the Wonderbolts and fangirling like mad over seeing them after Sonic Rainboom. Do you remember that? Because I sure as hell do, so why the hell did she even need to act like she is? It doesn't make sense. Rarity's dream hunk turning out to be an asshole, which something she could have easily seen coming if not being blinded by her inhibitions, at least she ended up making up for that. Just that sometimes her intelligence can really prove detrimental. And honestly, the fact that this is a sensible, classy affair makes Pinkie Pie's use of the hokey fucking cokey even more egregious. No wonder you were stuck in a quote-unquote children's party niche for the first few seasons. If you solidified that with this, it makes me want to push my fingers into my eyes and walk around blind forevermore, knowing that some people were stupid enough to even put that in there. All this abrasive and outright awful character writing could have been salvageable should you have managed to enable a dreams don't always turn out how you expect them to moral. At least it would have been able to justify the elaborate posturing from all concerned. Unfortunately, it's just left to fester, drowning an episode of little substance in a pool of turgid liquid that struggles to swim back against a tide that has enabled itself to function against any form of capability. If not for the musical number, the animated flourishes, and this new location alongside, honestly, Rarity's pitch-perfect resolution to her arc in putting blue blood on his arse, I swear this could have been higher on the list. It's extremely difficult to watch these characters hit brick wall after brick wall that damages their credibility, and then just shrug it off because Celestia said it was fine? What? That doesn't make any sense! What hurts even more is that this was the last thing of the first season. If I hadn't already committed to watching on further, I might have decided that this poor quality episode was worthy enough for me not to do so. It's that bad. Yet surprisingly, managed to accrue enough points to where it could salvage its own ass from devastation. It has been overshadowed and overtaken by efforts that I've personally deemed worse since. If I am this annoyed after only the third entry out of 25, then you know from here on it can only get worse and my blood pressure will continue to rise. When trying to teach morals surrounding things that could be alien to children, it must be dealt with a sense of humility and poise. Examples such as highlighting the reality of fame's unglamorous underbelly sounded like it would echo in a mature triumph for this show. Sadly, Season 4's Twilight Time attempted this, but ended up putting its foot into its mouth on more than one occasion trying. Despite a solid moral and thematic standing to improve from, it's the one thing that keeps this episode above water. Much like its neighbour in crime, Ponyville Confidential from Season 2, it took our rambunctious trio and showed off their most selfish, inconsiderate, and petulant sides, all while allowing their main villains to play them like putty in their hands. Hooves, I mean. The sight of Twilight gorging on burgers was worth the price of admission alone. God, that still makes me laugh after all these years. But the rest of it, slow burning and uncomfortable, leading to a lie that snowballs into something that you know was going to bite them in the arse, but instead of thinking logically, they just went along with it. I know it's meant to be on the nose and on the rails to show kids the negatives of the practice in action, but much like Ponyville Confidential, it's glad-handed. It's too earnest in displaying this where it loses all sense of direction. It leaves you with negative impressions of these girls in all the name of humbling progress. But unlike Ponyville Confidential, it's not funny or interesting in any way whatsoever to see unfold. Boy does it hit with the impact of a baby's limp punch, and if you've been hit by a baby, even with the assistance of someone else's arm moving it, you know just how delicate and soft that is. Anyway, Twilight Time is a weird little animal that doesn't shy away from the inspiration that it got from 2 seasons prior and doesn't manage to change the formula. In fact, Ponyville Confidential barely missed out on making this list itself, I believe scoring the same as this did. But the fact fact that Twilight Time doubled down on a story, a process, the execution of a moral, and echoing a displeasing tone throughout means that you can't make a follow-up any better by just copying it. You can clone a sheep and herald it as an achievement, but when that DNA shows the same negative genomes and chromosomes, what hope does it have? All it has to look forward to in its future is a euthanasia worth partaking in. And yes, I have just made a Dolly the Sheep analogy in 2020. Get over yourself, this is the kind of astute analysis that you're here for. Out of all the CMCs, Sweetie Belle was the runt of the litter. Whilst Apple Bloom and Scootaloo got multiple episodes to fuel and streamline their characters, the mini Marshmallow was only given a few sentimental romps with rarity that kind of bled into one another. Thankfully, both Sisterhood Social and Forever Philly are both rewarding episodes to watch. Unfortunately, one did more damage and made less sense than the two it was sandwiched between. The whole idea of Sweetie Belle feeling upstaged by her sister enough to act severe revenge felt out of character for this kind of considerate and at times overzealous Marshmallow. Yes, I'm going to keep comparing her to it, do not ask. Given how they'd patched up their issues in Sisterhood Social 2 seasons earlier, this just felt like a desperate attempt to find something for Sweetie Belle to complain about, all before it snowballed into an unnecessary wild goose chase of guilt and reparation that served up nothing worthy really getting excited over in the process. It spent too long manufacturing dissent between Sweetie Belle's memories of and her interpretation of her sister, making it feel like its season 2 counterpart with the roles reversed, making it feel uninspired and flat. By the time it reached its laboured conclusion, where even the smallest implications of impact resulting from her egotistical actions could have saved some face, but it wasn't given the chance to really feel genuine, further compounding this episode's failings. Saved from the pit of despair by those costume designs, some intricate dreamy set pieces, and some sense of moral equivalence that did ring through, For Whom the Sweetie Belle Toils, which should be For Whom the Sweetie Belle Tolls, but they didn't want to get censored or sued by Metallica, was an exercise in lazy contempt and rams home that point ad nauseum. It's a wholly irrelevant episode that, outside of giving Sweetie Belle her quote-unquote Princess Luna dream revelation TM, served no other purpose and failed to inspire any sense of enjoyment out of its dominant urgency to force conflict into something that didn't really necessarily need it in the first place. It shows how empty Sweetie Belle as a character is, and while the prior and future episodes featuring those sisters also highlight this, they didn't have as damaging effect as this one, and boy it hurts to witness every time. There's roasting a marshmallow over a fire, and then there's burning it. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the latter. Friendship is Magic is a show that has expansive lore, which for one aimed at the demographic and age range of it, is unsurprisingly rare. Characters' current personalities have been shown to have been the result of things that we have seen, but sometimes character aspects that we haven't seen needed to be fleshed out, or in the case of Applejack and her lion party of one, stuck out like a sore thumb to the point where they needed to address it or face fan wrath. So seeing background Pony grow from a liar of the highest order into the honest, blunt and truthful Pony we see today seemed like a good idea. Sadly, the episode itself wasn't really anything to write home about. At all, actually. Exposing the formative years of two characters, showcasing two divergent personalities to what we know was eye-opening, and could have carried some weight if given the proper story to convey it. However, where the apple lies key problem was taking a conflict and stretching its necessary usage until breaking point. You can use Big Mac's big mouth and Applejack's lying mouth once and ramp up the stakes and show the viewers how damaging your own personal reputation this could be, but instead they let one lie just snowball to the point of absurdity as the episode cracked under the weight of its own cringe-inducing attitude towards itself. A tale that could have been exploratory and fun became turgid and remorseless in its barren desire to throw their sensibilities right out the goddamn window. In all fairness, giving the substance of what there is, I could have actually enjoyed this if it had its head screwed on instead of making me squirm just so it could ram home the point it wanted to make from the first moment it was on screen. Sometimes being transparent and obvious doesn't prove to be the most clear-headed thing ever put into Flash, and showing showing how Applejack and Big Mac's negative attitudes came to being as a result of their parents' deaths impacting them. Now that could have been anticipated viewing, as well as fleshing out their journey and how they got to this point, instead of creating polar opposites just to exist so they could have a flashback episode as an excuse to give us a quote-unquote alternate universe version of two characters who'd already played on minimal cliches already. While I understand the intention of this episode was a good one, by sapping all entertainment out of it and sacrificing the quality of the story to pedal forced developments and hamming up the tension artificially means that all potential it has goes down the drain. And that's just sad. What could have been an introspective and insightful episode was insipid and irritating. This episode felt like the aforementioned Twilight Time, running on the rails to where you just couldn't enjoy it at all, as its sights were set on the end goal to where all that happens in between is all for nothing. It's just not good at all. Sometimes, albeit rarely, this show would attempt to mix things up by playing with its storytelling formula that had become standard by this point. And one of those experiments was simultaneous double-headers, 2 episodes that were back-to-back in the episode release schedule that shared the same continuity. Now, this is quite a bold step to take for a show such as this, and if it was executed correctly, could have actually proven to be rather interesting. It only happened twice. Both times they were not able to recoup the best results. Season 5's Made in Manhattan and Brotherhood Social were not spectacular, and outside of the opening acts, both of them never had much overlap. Season 3's Just for Sidekicks and Games Ponies Play, however, did manage to have both episodes coexist within earshot of one another. The former was actually not too bad, in fact I gave it this rating. The same, however, could not be said for its partner in crime, who was just one fix away from potentially being able to match it. I honestly have no problem with a deeper showing of the Crystal Empire in anticipation for the Equestria Games selection. Neither with the wrong person being swept up in the whole situation, as that could have still been used effectively. What I have issue with is how it was executed, as stupidity derailed all potential it could have had. Firstly, who rightfully only offers up the colour and pattern of someone's luggage in an effort to locate them, especially if they're of such importance, as well as not sending local representatives either? That made no sense, considering you can just go into a store and, well, see how easily the luggage part could go wrong. You're left really frustrated. It was just a way for the main 6 to be in an episode that they honestly had no right partaking in, I'm guessing. Secondly, and more importantly, why were we shown that they got it wrong in the first place? Due to the vagueness of said information, as it rendered the eventual reveal and a calm tension that would have provided completely null and void, making this whole palaver feel like a waste of time, with a conclusion that feels wholly undeserved given the circumstances. Because seriously, if this happened in real life, your town, city or country of origin would not be getting that games, and it would not be a contest at all. It's just painful knowing that eventually they're going to realise their mistake, and we as viewers can do nothing to convince them otherwise. All you can do is sit back and watch this episode as it self-destructs. Now here's a good thing, not showing Miss Harshwinnie until she announces herself later on. That would have been incredible and would have made this serviceable. Instead, we get an episode that from the start procedurally digs its own grave ever deeper, with decision making and a lack of intelligence that just makes every aspect lose any steam when firmly put up against it. And they say, with the butterfly effect, that one change can affect everything? Well, with Games Ponies Play, there is no better definition of that, especially when you realise what this episode is at its core, a car crash of an in-show tourist advert. This show's 8th season in the fallout of the feature film had one job to do: to build on a variety of characters and locations in response to an expanding of the lore and world building. The School of Friendship, visiting Sunburst and Starlight's hometown, and exploring the world of the Hippogriffs more in depth was a fantastic use of it. Unfortunately, not all of them got it right. It wasn't a bad idea to have an episode focused directly on Celestia, because not only was it long overdue, the fact it hadn't been done before was a bit of a crime. The choice to have Twilight, though, mosey in and completely derail it, however? Yeah, that was a bad idea. Twilight twisted Celestia's interest in theatre into a convoluted, scatterbrained and feeble desire to try and impress her mentor with her skills, all by sticking her nose in business that wasn't hers to begin with and creating an anxiety-inducing mantra that constantly butted heads with everyone who thought it was a bad idea and routinely had the production falling apart to compound those assumptions. If an episode ever needed to not have been made because of how difficult it is to justify in terms of character motives, results, and lack of entertainment, you will not find a better example than here. It's fucking horseplay, literally of the highest order, only saved by moments of absurd comedy, some decent animation, and costume effects, and the heartfelt proclamation of a recycled moral that breathed some light into something that was detestable right from the damn off. It was a deer in the headlights, self-aggrandizing when completely unneeded, and had as much sincerity as a war criminal lying on the stand. It was awful, and should have been lower than this, because it repeatedly shot itself in the foot with its mindless efforts, only being saved when it could scramble together its parts to form the smallest of boats to save its failing body from the sea. This is an example of this show shoehorning our main characters into an episode they could have easily backed away from. Without Twilight, this could have been fun, this could have been joyful. Instead, I got a concussion from banging my head against the wall. And you know what? This isn't even the worst of it yet. God help me. As noted in the last episode selection, Season 8's job was solidifying and clarifying things about the series lore that needed attending to. One of them was the fate of the fabled Pillars of Equestria, who debuted in the prior season's finale, and outside of Starswell's middling contribution to the insanely forgettable Friendship University, they really hadn't been touched upon. That was until Rockhoof had trouble fitting into modern Equestria, and well, alongside offering us an answer to what happened to the rest of the Pillars, it also beat the same drum so often that by its end it had very little consequence of its actions to show for itself. You can only watch one character routinely fail so many times in such a short space of time to where all empathy and sympathy are lost, as you become irrationally annoyed at just how transparently this plot point and conflict is being drilled right into your skull. I could handle it for the first montage and series of failed attempts, but the longer it went on, the more impatient and irritated I became. This episode had a one-trick pony of a premise and had it dancing so often its legs fell off. It retrod the same ground with only a minor change of paint to compensate, whilst making any sense of advancement redundant. The fact that all the other pillars had moved on so quickly and found a place instead of roaming together and seeing the process unfold for ourselves meant that this episode lacked the depth necessary to retain interest that it was sorely lacking. You can only watch Rockhoof unintentionally destroy things so many times before the episode's clear lack of ideas becomes painfully apparent. And while he avoided being turned into a statue due to his depression, it felt like a cheap cop-out to resurrect good feeling from an episode that had none from the start and stubbornly refused to change tact. Being stuck between a Rockhoof and a hard place, and the potential of what it could have been, was a tough pill to swallow, honestly. I admire its devotion to try and highlight the issues that one can have when stuck at a crossroads in life, but after Flutterbrutter 2 seasons earlier did it with much more to offer you, you can only just shrug your shoulders and move on quickly from an episode that, despite a decent idea, couldn't handle its woeful execution to save its life, and honestly, suffered immensely from it. From the get-go, this show was trapped in a compromising vice between Lauren Faust's bold, modern interpretation of what My Little Pony could be versus Hasbro's desire to retain it with archaic merchandising and marketing practices that the franchise had been entrenched in for decades. Faust wanted these characters to go on big adventures through dungeons, mountains, swamps, and okay, learning some morals along the way too, but at least it would appeal to boys and girls, much like Gen 1 had done, through some quite intense adventures when you look back on them. Hasbro, well, they just went, oh, it's a little girl's cartoon, so therefore we need to fill it with dresses and fashion and fucking sleepovers, because that's what little girls like, right? This show was expected to challenge conventional female cliches when it came to TV programming, whilst it also had to support them at the same time. If that isn't a conflict of interest, I do not know what one is. So, when you look at the show in broader terms, okay, you can at least look at Rarity and say, well, they managed to at least play it off in terms of the fashion side as a character trait, so you can have its appearance be warranted for continuity and character development, which makes sense. But when it came to some episodes, you could really tell that Hasbro had their filthy hands all over it, like it had come straight from a board meeting of marketing executives rather than being written by actual people, which meant, much like the entry I'm about to talk about, it had its wings clipped before it even had the chance to fly. The idea of a sleepover episode featuring these ponies does not sound like an awful one on paper, as a little bit of creativity, given the magical equines at their disposal and Applejack, could have made this worthwhile. Look Before You Sleep, however, played out like the quote-unquote My First Sleepover chapter of a book titled How to Portray a Typical Little Girl on Television, putting the most diametrically opposing characters in the same room as a socially awkward nerd hosted her first ever of the kind, in trying to make a conflict out of a situation, but that only served to sap the entertainment out of it faster than a leech on an infected wound. Labouring its way through all the conventional activities before wiping the slate clean every time, it lost the effect of progress, meaning that it was just a checklist that had to be ticked off and swiftly moved on from, to where nothing of note actually happened. Even the sight of Applejack and the frilliest monstrosity the show has ever made, which is saying something given Smolder's equally stirring ensemble some 7 years later, didn't help make you feel like it was anything more than underwhelming in its by-the-numbers execution. The static location meant that it got tired very fast, to where the classist conflict between the muddy and the flawless rarely invigorated viewing at all. Any potential attempts then at adding some vitality were just ignored, making apathy fester even more. The lack of Spike just spiced things up a bit was notably felt. Not visualizing the headless horse story, which could have really spiced things up, was tragic. And as noted, not giving the activities any permanence just, well, led to apathy. When you really look back on the contents of this episode, there really was rarely any excitement to be had, to where the magnitude of a storm crashing the party felt so synthetic and artificial, as a way to imply that Rarity and Applejack's feud really was nothing worth fighting over. It just made me facepalm how blunt this episode had handled itself. And honestly, Look Before You Sleep is one episode you can just watch as a nostalgic memory of this show's early years and think nothing of it, which is exactly why it ends up on this list. If it's not the slightest bit memorable and a slog to get through, what worth does it honestly have for you watching at home? Especially when it does nothing with a premise that has been an old reliable of cartoons gone by. Shows like Dexter's Lab, Lloyd in Space, Codename Kids Next Door, The Loud House, and Fairly Odd Parents took this children's entertainment cliche and made something interesting out of it. Here? Well, this was as redundant an idea stemming from marketing executives stuck in the past as you could get. How disappointing. When you look back on the sheer number of pop culture references featured in the show over the years, whether they be big or small, you can tell that the writers and the animators had a lot of fun implementing them, but it also highlighted to you at home just how much pop culture and media has influenced them and how they were willing to showcase that in their creative process. Therefore, when it came to adapting the Akira Kurosawa classic Rashomon and the famous narrative structure that the film innovated into an episode, you might have expected that it would have supplied us some twists and some turns that would have made the conflict interesting and exciting. But, and it's a big but, and I definitely cannot lie, instead of that, I had to be reminded that this was a show for younger children, meaning when they actually had a chance to showcase it, my god, it was nothing of the sort. P.P.O.V, or Pony Point of View if you want to get serious about this, was meant to be something new, interesting and intriguing, at least for this show. A mystery to grip us from beginning to end and leave us questioning whose account of it was true. From the get-go, however, you realise just how much of a fraud this setup truly is. The whole idea falls apart when you recount that these main characters have had fights in the past and made amends, no matter how bad things are. So why would a bungled boat trip cause so much animosity? That's a slap in the face to what we as viewers know. Well, without it, we wouldn't have had a reason to piece 3 repetitive, arbitrary and convoluted recollections together, all of which are so strikingly similar, with one major difference to where any suspense and sense of deduction is thrown under a bus. That corpse is then flattened by another bus when its revelation is not as grand as it was retold. Said corpse is then pureed into a fine paste when it was used as a vehicle for a watered down moral and an opportunity for Twilight to once again stand tall as a capable hero trope, like it's become tradition around here. It had lost its steam way before this point, mind, only having spiked sharp jabs at the absurdity of it all, making me as an adult viewer perk up and laugh from time to time. Over time, however, the benign and tone-deaf nature of this was just all too much. When the moral about working together as a team felt tacked on, almost like they couldn't figure out what this whole thing could convey, makes you realise that this ship was without a captain from the beginning. Overall, P.P.O.V was an occasion where the limits of the show's age rating and target demographic ruined a concept that could have been more than the sum of its meagre parts. But much like Look Before You Sleep, it was a watered down piece of media to where any sense of direction with it was lost in the process. It left me speechless, but for all the wrong reasons when it aired, and honestly, the fact it stands up as the worst of my favourite season really does imply just how terrible it is. If Spike, Rarity's Titanic dress, and the colossal sights of the impending waves alongside the reliable narrative structure were the only things keeping this one afloat, you know that it's a mystery just best left unsolved. The ending of a long-standing story should feel momentous, something that is rewarding and feel like the journey was worth embarking on. To have that not be the case hurts. A lot. It hurts even more though, when it barely made the effort to have it be worth watching. It hurts even more than that, to have it be the last thing we witness before a show concluding triple header. That's the taste in my mouth I wish I could wash out with more soap. Given that this show had already had one momentous wedding and went through the entire process of getting to that major event, they had to tackle Sugar Belle and Big Max a little differently. And they did so by throwing the narrative structure formbook right out of the window and hitting someone in the head on the way down, making it as over the top and as maddening as humanly possible. You'd think that would provide the summarily desired entertainment to push it forward, right? Well, alas, what we were left with is a jumbled mess that only serves to bookend the one moment you actually came here for and offer up literally nothing of consequence in return. Did we really need a moral about smaller expressions being more meaningful than grand gestures being represented so transparently, with so much asinine and deceitfully forced tension to come from it, to where you wonder why they went through all of this just for a proposal that had a predictable outcome anyway? It's just such a confusing collection of corrupting contraptions that make any sense just fall away from this one. And while the core idea was interesting, the way they went about getting there just ruined it. The end goal was a lovely moment, but I didn't need to sit wincing through 20 minutes of a 22-minute episode to see it. I could have just watched it on YouTube. That is what makes the Big Mac question such a chore. It's padded out something so heavily you can feel the impact of its thoughtlessness, its untidiness, and reckless desire to proclaim its importance while the episode progresses and crumbles around it. It's not natural and feels so laboured. No wonder it flopped as hard as it did. This was not the appetizer for the series end that I or anyone wanted. At least these two lovebirds lived happily ever after. There's one positive to take from this colossal waste of time. Consistent character growth is something that this show has in vain attempted to juggle with, bequeathing to us uneven results due to it. Fluttershy is a key example of this. After achieving her main goal of becoming more assertive and showing her more sociable and driven side from Season 2 and beyond, you really could only see so much of that growth before it becomes as flanderized and tired as her shyness was, no matter how endearing it could be. When combined with the ineptitude and cartoonish stupidity carried out by supposed professionals, what you get is an episode that then squanders her in any sense of realism a situation like it could have, all to make a conflict as asinine as possible. This is Fluttershy Leans In, everyone, and boy does it sting. The story of Fluttershy building an animal sanctuary should have been relatively simple in terms of plot and character writing, using her assertiveness to get what she wants and going up against a couple of barriers in the process of doing it. That's all it is, really. It's an episode that, based on premise alone, had very little to offer, which is why shoehorning a bunch of stereotypically negative professionals to shove conflict about the professional-client relationship, which something that Suited for Success did some years earlier and did so with more clarity and precision, despite still proving as fractious and ignorant as it could be, that meant that this episode stuttered, stumbled, and stupidly exercised very little creative impetus, especially when it came to its pacing, tone, and animation, which was bereft of any real moments of quality, all while a lumbering tension exuded from its pores and made me uneasy and anxious as to why such a clear and easy to play out story was being handled in such a complicated way. There was no need to overcomplicate it by adding supporting characters needlessly, or funneling in outsiders for minimal contact for conflict's sake, but by doing it, it highlighted just how barren and meagre this idea truly was before they even started adding elements to pad it out and progressively lose its mind. On top of that, some plot holes further convolute matters. Gillian M. Barrow's convenient lack of using Fluttershy's animal talking ability, the first time of which since Best Night Ever, oh good lord I've mentioned that hellspawn again, to resolve Dr. Fauna's situation, only for Dr. Fauna herself to magically resolve it and then revert back to the starting point like it was nothing, was infuriating. And the fact that Big Daddy McColt made an unexpected cameo wasn't satisfying. He was brought in to resolve the contractor problem. Why the blue fuck couldn't you have done that from the start? Because that would have meant that this episode would have no grounds for existing at all. Instead of using forethought and logic, Gillian M. Barrow backed this episode into a corner to where it just could not save itself. This episode tried too hard, had no stability, and tried to give us too much to where it constantly tripped over itself, and boy did it impact on its quality immensely. Even its moral was patronising and tepid, giving us a feel-good ending that it didn't deserve, all in a vain effort to try and mask over its failings with saccharine sentiments, only to be found out and subsequently embarrassed for trying to even attempt it. Surprisingly, some minimal positives are found here, such as some nicely facilitated musical flourishes, Nicole Oliver's humorous return of Dr. Fauna, and a good use of Fluttershy's development from the past as a way to implement change in her overall character and story for the plot device. These were enough to take it out of the fire and save its life, but sometimes I look back at the rating I gave and my experiences watching it, and I question why the writers and team behind it didn't just leave Fluttershy Leans In to burn to death. Because it was filler that even negatively exceeded the expectations of filler. That is something difficult to even believe it achieved. And honestly, it was an early sign of this show just starting to falter. And it makes me wince even just remembering it. That is not a good sign. It systematically destroyed itself from within, all because it tried so damn hard to make you believe it had a reason to exist. Boy did it cry wolf so hard that even I couldn't care. What a shame. And with that, we're going to stop there. You're going to have to wait until part 2 to find out what the absolute worst MLP episode is. If you're enticed to stick around and wait to find out with earnest anticipation, then click the subscribe button and hit that notification bell so you do not miss when it eventually goes up. However, if you are one of those people who are watching in the future, hopefully the world hasn't gone to shit, you can click the playlist in the description, or look in the sidebar, or click the channel icon down there to find it, because it's out there. So yeah, people of the future, you are in luck. You don't have to wait for this. People of the past who are watching this when it airs, yeah. Click the subscribe button and click the notification bell. I don't want to repeat myself, but there we go. I've been Freddie Thomas, you've been people watching, this is the CC Network, and I'll see you all next time.